So the next thing that we are going to talk about is backend maintenance. So let me do this other instance because it's already up and running. So I'm going to walk you through navigating the backend of dotCMS. Most of these areas we're going to go over real quick because as a system administrator, there's not a lot that you'll end up doing in these areas, but it is important to understand where they are. We have a dashboard which gives some nice analytics for people who are interested in those sorts of things. We don't really end up getting a lot of questions about this. There's a task list for which is mostly related to workflows. As someone edits a piece of content, they hit save, and the workflow associated says, oh, okay, well, before anything else happens, this script has to be reviewed by our legal department. And so someone who is a member of the legal department will log in, and they'll see a task there of review the landing page, for example, before it can go on to the next step in the workflow. The Site tab is where you can see the website as it displays to people who are not logged in. You can walk through the application tree. You can go into folders. You can edit the folders. You can get information about them. You can go into specific objects. You can either look at them to edit, or you can look at their properties to get more information. Often we'll encounter people who have problems with permissions on objects. Someone that they think should have permissions on something doesn't, and so you can come in here to the page properties and see, oh, well, what are the permissions on this object? Do they actually have what they think they have? Do they have the correct roles to be able to access this? Generally, things are going to get their permissions from their parent, so you can walk up the tree as necessary to see that the permissions are correct. You can look at a history of objects. You can go back to earlier versions of the objects. If someone has made an edit that's broken things in the content, then you can actually go back to a previous version if that's useful. The cache, the page cache that we talked about earlier is located in here. So as the system administrator, most of what you would deal with in this arena is going to be permissions. There's a link tool for running link checkers. There's templates. So templates are the containers that define a particular web page, and different pages have different templates. If people are having problems with page layout and you need to look at something, you can come into one of these and you can see what the template is actually, what the actual code of the template is. You can get in there and check to make sure that there's not, invalid characters or bad VTL or something like that. Containers are blocks that exist within templates. So the templates are made out of containers. You have your subnav menu, you can have a carousel, you can have promotions blocks, you can have columns, and these are kind of generic building blocks. We don't tend to get a whole lot of problems with containers, but you can, if someone is having a problem with them, here's where you'd come in. Like, you can check and see, does someone not have permission to access that container and they're trying to edit something in it? Those sorts of things can all be handled here. There is some custom coding that people can put into containers. Your developers can. And here's where you would find that. You'd come in and look in the pre-loop. You can look in what other particular blocks they have in these containers that may execute special code before or after display. Again, containers, the most common reason a sysadmin would be in this area is looking at permissions or rolling back to an earlier version. There's what's called Time Machine. It sounds like it's a backup utility. It is not. Time Machine is a way for a content creator, a content architect, or developer to look at what is this web page going to look like at this point in time, or what did it look like at this previous point in time. So you can select a date and a category, and it will create a snapshot and say, this is what it's going to look like at that point in time. If people are using Time Machine a lot, and you can schedule Time Machine snapshots, this can end up eating up a lot of disk space. Looks like that has moved. Oh, I might have put that outside of there. So let's look at there we go. And actually, I haven't generated any bundles in that environment, so there aren't any yet. But they're under your assets. There can be a folder called Time Machine and a folder called Bundles. Both of these can grow pretty large and chew up a lot of disk space if you're not monitoring them carefully. There's no tooling within dotCMS to monitor those. It's something you have to manage at the file system level. So getting rid of old Time Machine snapshots that aren't necessary anymore, the chances that someone's going to want to look back and see, well, what did our website look like 8 months ago? That's pretty unlikely. You can probably delete those old ones. And when we talk about push publishing, I'll get into the bundles, which is the other thing that you might end up seeing use a lot of disk space there. There's a publishing queue. So when someone selects to push publish something, it pops into this queue showing what's due to happen, get a history of what has happened. If there's a problem with the bundle, it'll show a status of failed, and you can click on that and get information about why it failed, which can help you to troubleshoot, fix whatever's wrong in the code or in the configuration of that bundle, and then repush it. You can actually see a listing of the bundles and download them. So if there's a problem with the bundle and you want to bring it down to a developer workstation to do some troubleshooting, that's how you can do that. The next area is the content area, which is really the content are all objects that populate the containers in the templates. So marketing widget, the Bear Mountain Trail, headers, banners, about us. These are just blocks of content here. So you can see information about them. You can check out their properties or permissions. Because you may have a page where everything's showing fine except for this one block. Well, it's probably here in the content that you're going to find a permissions problem rather than in the looking at the page itself. There's a calendar tool for managing events that display on the site. It's pretty straightforward. It's just a calendar tool. I don't think I've ever encountered any trouble tickets about the calendar. The link checker can validate all of your links. So the links up here. Oh, sorry. The links here, these are shortcuts. They're redirects, essentially, either 301 or 302 redirects. So if I want to add one, I can simply say, oh, new It's going to go to About Us, save. And so you can create a new path. So, for example, if someone goes to / Bear Mountain, it's going to redirect to one pager, wherever those one pagers happen to be. So that's useful little utility. It was previously called vanity URLs. I didn't realize we changed that. No, but vanity URLs is still there. Interesting. So this is the same thing. Oh no, those are a little different. Okay. So this is where it's the 301 and 302 redirects. By default, I believe they're 301s. And so you can take any 404, redirect it to a custom 404 page. If you have a commonly accessed page, we see environments where people have hundreds and hundreds of these vanity URLs to give people shortcuts. So they don't, if there's something that is 4 levels deep in the site, but it's really popular, they can create a short URI redirecting to that here without having to use like a Tucky plugin or something like that, and not having to do anything at the Tomcat level. Under the marketing, like rules and forms aren't issues we ever, as sysadmins, see a whole lot of questions about. They're pretty simple, straightforward tools. If someone does have a question about them, this is where you would come to look at them. Types and tags. You'll sometimes get questions about content types. If people have created a custom content type and they're having a problem with things not displaying the way they expect, or their forms aren't populating it properly, you can come in here and make sure that the content type is set up properly. Make sure that they have it working the way that they think that it should be. You can list the fields in it. You can look at relationships between content types. Any permissions on that content type. So yeah, that's all located here under content types. You'll sometimes get some questions about those. Generally, though, the developers who are creating a content type are familiar enough with the rules for it and the guidelines for coding those that it's not an issue. Categories and tags are just taxonomies for managing display. They're going to be used primarily in VTL to say pull all content that has the tag Australia, so we can populate a more articles like this sort of box. Workflows are a pretty powerful tool here. I won't go into a lot of detail about how to use them, but workflows manage how things get published, how things end up showing up on the site. And you can see here real quick, the basic system workflow is an object gets created, it's in the unpublished state. It can be then published or archived. For something that's going to need to, it's a document, it's going to go through a review and legal approval process. So there's a couple more steps that have to happen before that object can show up. Like someone can edit it, hit save and publish, and say, okay, I'm done with it. It should be on the site. Well, it still has to go through review. It still has to go through legal approval. So it's not going to show up on the site right away until it has gone through those workflows. Languages, here's where you can manage adding and removing languages. It doesn't do translation. You actually have to manually go in and add the multilingual content yourself, but this allows multilingual content to work and supports what languages are available. There's a couple of dev tools. The first of which is the dynamic plugins. So as we talked about earlier, dynamic plugins are generally little utilities that can be used that don't require loading prior to dotCMS starting up, like the static plugins. These are based on the OSGI framework, so you can any OSGI compliant plugin approach would be usable here. You can upload a plugin. If there are plugins, you can load them. You can restart the framework. So if you've added a plugin that requires the framework to restart, you don't have to restart dotCMS to get that plugin to work. You just restart the OSGI framework. There's a list of all of the packages that are provided. So if your dynamic plugin needs to access various tools, we have a list of all the ones that are already built in, so you don't have to worry about including them. So those are dynamic plugins, essentially. Dynamic plugins either work or they don't. So if someone uploads a dynamic plugin and it won't start, you go and you look at the log file, see if it gives an indication of why, and you can give them that feedback of, okay, well, here's the errors showing with the log when we try and load that plugin. Here's why it's not working, and then they go back and fix it. There are two query tools. Query tools, a Lucene syntax tool. ES is an Elasticsearch syntax tool. They both go against the index to find and return whatever objects you're curious about that match the search criteria. Site search is a utility that is used to limit basically to create a subset of the Elasticsearch index, and it creates a limited index for a subset of content to access. For example, a news section, you may run a site search every night on say you select what sites you're going to index. You can either use the alias you've already created, or you could create a new one. You can index whatever sites you want. It can be an incremental index, or you can run a fresh one every night. And you can add or include paths. You could say everything under the news section needs to be re-indexed in the site search every, however often, every hour, every 6 hours, whatever. And then you can reference this alias, this site search alias, in your VTL code to populate related stories or recently updated news of this type, those sorts of things. It's a pretty powerful tool. It's fairly useful. But as a system administrator, where you're going to spend most of your time is under the system tab. I'm going to talk more about roles and users in a little bit. We've already walked through configuration, except for the publishing environments, which I'll talk about when I talk about push publishing. So we'll start with sites. Sites are a host. You can have many hosts. I've seen dotCMS installs with dozens and dozens and hundreds of hosts, which will have their host name, will also have aliases. So you can have multiple URLs pointing at the same host. You can have 20 hosts here. All of them have multiple aliases. You will have a default host. If you have a DNS entry pointing to your dotCMS server, it comes in through whether it's a proxy server or a load balancer, whatever, and it makes it to dotCMS. And dotCMS says, well, the URL doesn't match any of my aliases, so it's just going to go to the default site. If you have 12 sites in here, but it doesn't match any of those 12 sites, it's going to try and go to that path on the default server. We don't tend to have a lot of problems with sites, but it is useful to know where they are and how they work. There's not a lot you can edit on the site. You can set up permissions. You can set up some rules on it from the rules tab of the content. And it's pretty straightforward. You can roll back to a previous setting of your host. But the most common issue, again, that you'll run into is sites. I don't talk about that when I talk about roles and permissions. The next section is the maintenance section. We talked a lot yesterday about the cache and the index parts of this. Those are the ones that you would spend probably 95% of your time working in a sysadmin role under the maintenance tab. There are a couple little tools here. The first of which is a backup tool. This is not an enterprise backup tool. This is I'm about to do something that may damage things, and I don't have access to the database server. I want to get a quick backup of my data. You can back up or download your data. You can back up or download your data and your assets. Now, if you have a large database or you have a lot of assets, this download may time out. If you have 30, 40 gigs of content, trying to download this could well time out. You're better off backing it up to the server. All that said, this does not include your plugins. This does not include your configuration. This does not include your dynamic plugins. It does not include your index or your cache or anything like that. You can't build out a new dotCMS install just from this backup. This is just your database and your assets, or just your data if that's all you select. And it's not even a backup as would be done by the database backup utility. So the next tool is a search and replace. And this will just do a very brute force search for this string, replace it with that string. It will not do any, are you sure? It will not do any prompting. It will just go through and find string A, replace it with string B in any text in your content. And we have this disclaimer here below the next task, but this really applies to everything on this page. You should have a full backup of your data and assets before running any of the tools on this page, because the potential for data loss is very high if you're not careful. So fix asset inconsistencies. This will go through and find any versions of content on the file system that are out of sync with the database, and it will correct that. So every time you make a change to content, a new version gets stored in the database. Every time you make a change to an asset, a PDF, a video file, MP3, whatever, and you replace it with a new version, we keep the old version so you can roll back to it. But you want to make sure that your database is pointing at the most recent version or the correct version. And so this fix asset inconsistencies will do that. It's something that you wouldn't want to do without checking in with us first. Say, hey, we're experiencing this problem. Would fix asset inconsistencies solve that? And we'll be glad to help you figure out if that's the appropriate tool for that. The next thing is the drop old assets version, where you select a date. Go to August 1st, 2017, and say, I want to get rid of all of the files on the file system that are older than that date that have something newer active. So if it goes and finds a PDF file that's from 2016, but that's the most recent version of that PDF, it's going to keep it. It will never leave you with 0 versions of an object. It'll keep the most recent ones. It'll keep all of the ones newer than this date, and it will keep the newest version of every object. So you can run this utility to clean up some disk space. You can clean just binaries, PDFs, video files, etc., or you can clean just file assets, CSS files, VTL files, or you can clean both. There's a delete content tool. Now, where this would most likely be utilized would be, for example, you had a big promotional campaign for some particular product, and the campaign is over and you have a whole bunch of content related to the special promotion that you want to get rid of, someone from marketing would go into the dev tools, run a query here, either a Lucene or an Elasticsearch query, and get back a list of 100 objects related to this this promotion that you want to get rid of. And they'd simply say, here's all of the identifiers of the content we want to get rid of, paste them in here and delete them. It's a handy little tool for those kinds of situations where they don't want to go in to every single content object one by one and manually delete them. But they can craft a query that's precise enough to only get the things they want to get rid of. Next up is your delete pushed assets history. So push publishing tries to be efficient. If we've pushed an asset and that asset hasn't changed, then if you try and push it again, we won't do so. Push publishing will simply say, oh, well, the most recent version of that has already been pushed, so I don't need to do anything. There will be cases where something got broken on the target server, there was a data loss, someone accidentally logged in and deleted something. So you can delete the pushed assets history, and it will repush those assets after that point. And then finally, there's an asset search and replace utility. This works the same as the text one up here at the top of the page, except that it runs against your assets folder on the disk. So it'll go through HTML files, CSS files, JavaScript files, VTL files on your disk in your assets folder and make that replacement. And again, you should always have a backup before running any of these utilities. The next section is the log files, and I don't know that I actually have this configured. No, I don't. So the log files utility, you'll have a drop down here. I can't show you on that either. So it shows a drop down of whatever log files are available on the system. So if you don't have direct access to the server, you can't shell into the server and look at the log files. This will allow you to pull them up in the console. The downside is you can't look back in time. You can only look from the moment that you select the file going forward. So if someone is having a problem and you want to replicate it, you can come in here and start tailing the log file. You can pop it up and it'll show up in a separate window, and you can follow the log file as you're replicating what they're experiencing. There's a system info tab. This just is a quick snapshot of things that may be of interest. What port are you running on? What Java version are you using? What are the Java ops in your startup? What is the path to dotCMS? All those kinds of things are right here in this system info tab. There's a thread utility. It's not the best way to get a thread dump. Ideally, if you need to get a thread dump, you do it using the thread dump utility in your JDK. So in this case, I want to grab a thread dump of the current running dotCMS process. So there we go. You can grab it from here. It's, as I said, it's not the most reliable or accurate way to do it, but in a pinch, it's better than not getting a thread dump at all. You can also reload it to get a refresh of your thread dump. You can select it all if you want to copy it, paste it into a ticket, that sort of thing. A lot of times what you can see happen If there's a lot going on, it will start cutting off the bottom of the thread dump, which is part of why it's not the best way to do it. You just get better information doing it at the command line. But as I said, it's better than nothing. There's a logged users utility. This will tell you who is logged in, from where, how long they've been logged in. You can kick them out. If there's multiple users, you can select specific users to invalidate. You can refresh and make sure you have the most recent user list. Simply a little utility. So those are the essentials of the system administration tabs.